I'm your host, Jayson Reed, and you're listening to the first episode of the Panther Business Briefing, and that's on the theme of oil, gas, and energy. I'm joined here today with my co-host and business process analyst, Baran, Pourtahmaseb-Sasi. Now, I've been a part of FIU's student media since my undergrad, and I've seen plenty of podcasts come and go, and I, along with my team of contributors, believe that this would be the perfect medium to share the insights we've gained from our graduate studies with the FIU community. We received lots of support from our newspaper, Panther Now, and from the school's radio station, The Roar, and we are excited to get the most out of the body of expert knowledge that FIU has to offer. We've got a real treat for you all today. We'll be hearing from a professor of finance and international business with plenty of insight into the history and economics of our topic today. That's Dr. Ali Parhizgari. And now, it's time to go to class on oil and gas. We'd like to start out our discussion with a brief rundown of the history of domestic oil and gas from a consumer perspective. Now, back in the day, before cars were commonplace, the Standard Oil Trust ran the industry across the entire world. But as motor vehicles became cheaper and as economies of scale were developed by innovators like Henry Ford, the need for innovation in the industry to increase competition became a focus for lawmakers. In the 1910s, this massive corporation faced enormous lawsuits that eventually led to its fragmentation into some notable modern descendants like Marathon, BP, ExxonMobil, and dozens more. Throughout the period of the Great Depression and leading up to the Second World War, these newly independent arms of the Standard Oil Trust engaged in a famous oil rush of aggressive and mostly unregulated business practices. Throughout the 1920s, the industry saw frequent boom and bust cycles where these untapped reserves brought supply high, oil and gas prices down, and created unsustainable business models that rose and fell with significant volatility. These issues with instability highlighted the need for a more regulated market to prevent these problems that arise from unchecked production. And no place was more influential inside of the continental U.S. than the great state of Texas, and its most famous boom, which started with the discovery of the East Texas oil field. To address the chaos of the East Texas oil boom, enter the Texas Railroad Commission, which played a pivotal role in stabilizing the markets during the 1930s and had become the de facto regulator in the U.S.'s oil industry. Some practices they employed were known as pro-rationing, which involved setting maximum allowable production levels for each well based on the field's overall capacity. The system was very successful at stabilizing oil prices and prevented the countless price wars that had occurred during the 1920s. The TRC's pro-rationing system set an excellent precedent for the whole nation's regulatory framework, and this can be best seen with the New Deal's 1933 National Industry Recovery Act that included provisions for controlling oil production at a national level. Some additional aspects worth mentioning were the production quotas, minimum oil prices, and overhauled standards for wages, hours, and production practices. The U.S. remained the world's largest oil producer for several decades, and the regulatory practices established during the 1930s allowed the nation to play a leading role in the global oil markets. However, during the post-war period, many Western oil companies began expanding into the Middle East and Latin America. While this was enormously profitable for these corporations that set up operations there, the payoff structures were not nearly as comparable for the nations in question. One especially interesting case we'd like to discuss is that of Venezuela, which set a very notorious precedent in 1943 when it took a stand against the Anglo-American oil companies, which controlled 98% of their domestic industry. At that time, Venezuela was the world's third largest oil exporter and had a truly booming economy. When their legislature passed the Hydrocarbons law of 1943, it mandated that companies like Royal Dutch Shell and the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey would distribute 50% of their profits from oil production right back to the state. By the end of the decade, Venezuela's national income rose by nearly 600% and had positioned themselves at the head of the bargaining table for decades. Now, once this deal was officially finalized, other nations that felt they were being similarly exploited, and Saudi Arabia's king in particular would be an example, saw it as an opportunity to make their own agreements. After a few years of this new framework, many oil-producing and exporting countries came together and formed the most famous international organization of resource-rich nations in history. They called this OPEC. In 1960, representatives from Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and Kuwait all came together to coordinate and unify oil policies to ensure fair and stable prices for the producers under their purview. Now, during that decade, many other nations hopped on the OPEC train, setting up the 1970s to be the decade of oil. As the Pulitzer Prize-winning author and energy expert Daniel Yergin once wrote, quote, "The 1970s was a decade of crisis and redefinition of energy. It was when the oil weapon was unsheathed and the West suddenly found itself vulnerable to the oil-exporting nations." So now that we've established some of the context of what we'll be discussing today, we had the chance to sit down with an expert, Dr. Ali Parhizgari, who began his career in Washington, D.C., working with the Department of Energy and other public and private governmental agencies. He joined FIU in 1982 and has been an invaluable asset for our university as a leader, researcher, author, and professor. Here's what he had to say when we sat down with him last week. You know, we want to start with you, right? You're the star
Very
of
good.
today's show.
Very good then.
So we know you started in the University of Maryland, right? That's where you studied your PhD.
That's where I got my PhD. That's correct.
And you studied economics there. And
Right.
we were wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how the professors and the academic sphere there informed your opinions about oil and gas, and how possibly it could have challenged the ones that you had, growing up.
Yes, I think during those days, particularly in the early 70s, oil industry was going through a lot of changes, particularly due to the Arab oil embargo that happened at some point. And all of a sudden, the oil price, which was X amount, for example, became 4 times or 5 times within a short period of time. Then the political dimensions of it got accumulated, was added to all the other problems. And then a lot of efforts in terms of conservation, savings, economizing on the consumption of oil, particularly gasoline at the pump. All these basically popped up. Some of these considerations did not exist prior to the Arab oil embargo, which sort of jolted the market all of a sudden, and caused a lot of, I should say, political consideration of strategies regarding oil production, oil distribution, and things to that effect.
Because I know in the 70s that all the talk was about inflation, because you had Volcker coming in very soon to sort everything out.
Yeah, so inflation, of course, has been with us at all times, I should say. At some points, to the tune of up to very recently, 3.2% or whatever, or 3%. Prior to that, 9%. But there was a time that during the Carter administration that the inflation reached 14, 15%. The interest rate around those days jumped up to about 14, 15, 16%.
And right along at the same time as the oil embargo.
Reflecting the effect of inflation, oil embargo, and all the other things. But then when you look at it, the impact of oil was not really as much as all the other variables moved. A lot of other variables moved due to all sorts of other considerations.
Right, the CPI,
Right.
across,
At that time, it's a little bit historical right now. At that time, the impact of oil prices or the elasticity of oil prices, which is really a percentage change in price due to a percentage change in the demand, was figured out to be close to 1%. Of course, it depends on the level of consumption.
It seems nominal, not really an issue.
Right.
But,
Below, at some point, I should say elasticity was less than 1 because everybody needed a few gallons of oil in the tank to basically be happy with the family moving around and things to that effect. But then for a range, it was close to 1%, but then for higher levels of consumption, elasticity jumped above, say, 1.3, 1.4. But that's all there was. I mean, but having an inflation of 14, 15%
Plays into it, sure.
played into it, but then, and it is very easy to attribute all the problems to one easy one that everybody could locate.
Got to be holistic, that's for sure.
I know. So somebody had to have the hammer and hit something else with it, you know. Okay.
So I know. We kind of started off in the 70s, but let's try to take it back. Back to when Standard Oil ran the show. They had their hands in the pockets of everyone across the Middle East and South America, especially in the United States. And could you talk about the effect of these monopolies, and if you think there is a trend to monopolization now?
Well, I guess the oil industry has been a monopoly right from the beginning, right? Or no, in some form of monopoly. I may say that a perfect form of monopoly. But then there is one more interesting factor that relates to the oil industry that does not automatically relate to all the other commodities. Oil has got a political dimension that none of the other commodities in the world, even today that we are looking for some material for batteries and all the other things, so far I think oil has taken a lot of space in terms of political dimension. So therefore, when we talk about the impact of oil on anything else, there is an economic impact, which boils down to dollars and cents. There is a political impact. And sometimes I may say that the political impact precedes and even far exceeds the economic impact, In terms of politics, I may say that the industry itself has played a role in order to set the prices or even manipulate the prices as much as they could.
Yeah, you say industry, but could you argue that there's more than one oil industry with
yes,
oil producing and exporting countries?
I can argue that there is not a single one. I can argue that there are multiple units, even though I say they are a monopoly, but each one of them is a monopoly in its own term. In terms of economic definition, you could say it is an oligopolistic environment, meaning that there are a handful of them. But then we have separate ones, The ones that work in the Middle East, with OPEC, for example, by itself became some sort of a monopoly. The ones that work in Africa and in some other parts of the world sort of govern themselves a little bit differently.
Yeah.
But one thing was common. There was some sense of centralization in most of them.
And something we'd like to look at to try to understand where we got to today is looking at the history and going as far back as when it was literally the wild, wild west of the oil industry, where back in, say, the 10s and the 20s, right after Standard Oil got crushed, I think in 1919, was that? And it led to a boom and bust cycle where they'd overproduce, they'd overdrill, they'd make these boom towns that eventually dried up, and it ruined the economies. And it caused insane fluctuations and volatility in the oil prices. And then it didn't stop until the Texas Railroad Commission stepped in, especially in the East Texas oil fields, and they said that you need to pro-ration is what they use, where you had to limit the amount you could drill, you had to have some sort of known depletion schedule. And
I think so. That, well, the problem with those approaches at that time was that I don't want to call them localized. I may call them related to one nation, related to one region. The oil industry was a global industry. You couldn't control them, or we didn't exert any control over them when it came to their operations in the Middle East, for example. In the Middle East, they were a good part of changing the governments, creating coups, depending on what the other political incentives were. So therefore, they had their days of activities. And I may say that even today they have some influences. They are not gone. They're there.
For sure.
It's the nature of a lot of big businesses today. We cannot forget that. So even though a lot of rules and regulations were put into effect, which are still basically, which I may say were positive in the process, but they were very gradual, and I may call them evolutionary in the sense of popping up here and there, rectifying some problems that existed for a long time.
Would you say that if given the opportunity to regulate themselves, the oil industry simply would not, and that necessitated the government to step in?
I really don't think that any industry would regulate itself if it turns out to be at a disadvantage of those decisions.
Of course.
I'm sorry to say that. This runs against the capitalistic motives of some of the CEOs who are governing or running these industries. Now, unless we have some special ones with some CEOs or some boards who are especially dedicated, and there are rare. We are talking about millions of companies. Quite often you can identify a few who are basically law-abiding, self-regulating, etc., and etc. But then the majority of them, by definition, by their motives, do not fall in that group. So therefore, some external guidelines are really necessary. I know it runs counter to those who want to reduce government. I'm not saying a lot of governmental influences or rules should be in place.
We need to protect the consumer. That's the most important thing.
But there are some areas that things don't work out. Things do not work out.
Would you say that, because you can split up the oil and gas industry in terms of production into three parts: the upstream, the midstream, and the downstream, and the regulation on the upstream, the most risky, the production, the drilling, the exploration, that's extremely profitable in good times and absolutely abysmal in downturns. And in COVID, so many of these oil and gas exploration and production companies, they either went under, they had to sell their assets. Could you speak on the influence of integrated oil companies that have their hand in all these different segments versus just pure play?
I guess there is a positive and a negative side when you look at these integrations. On the negative side, it has given them the advantage of continuing to become monopolies or oligopolies in their standing situations. On the positive side, I may say that some actions or some productions are not economically feasible alternatives for small companies. Oil production is one of them.
Big investment.
There is economies of scale, economies of scope, that sometimes small companies may not be able to survive because the risk in variations, in volatility of prices, in distribution.
And you can't hedge it all.
And competition with one another is another part of it. When there are when there are many of them, it is very high. So the small ones by default will be wiped out.
Right.
This probably was not the case when we had a lot of fracturing in the United States, because some small ones basically continued, became larger. Mm-hmm. Of course.
What timeline? What decade would you say that would be?
That was about 15 years or so ago.
Right. Before shale.
When we started fracturing in the United States, we didn't. The technology, the methodology was written, but it had not been brought in.
With the horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing.
And of course, it came up with its own problems and with all the other negative things that we learned thereafter. Mm-hmm. But it increased the supply of oil to some extent. So therefore, back to your question, I may say that it's very hard to come up with a uniform judgment in terms of the effect of consolidation of the oil industry, but obviously, the way that the current situation is, that hopefully they are supposed to move away from dirty energy, the directions of the future is pretty much unknown. Is going to depend on a lot of other factors that I may say is not definitely within the domain of the oil industry, but rather within the geopolitical system in which the oil industry is operating.
Sure. Right? And speaking on that, the Middle East, historically, at least over the last, ever since the 70s, they've had an enormous amount of influence over global oil prices. Yes. But ever since the shale boom happened, and you had all these very young companies in the United States coming into Texas and just making a name for themselves, putting a 10, 20, 30, $40 billion valuation on these brand new companies. How would you say that this has shifted the balance of power in terms of demand domestically and globally?
I may say that the power of OPEC started to gradually diminish after mid-70s, gradually. And it happened...
Because they weren't regulated, right? They weren't regulating?
Because initially they were cohesive. The members were very cohesive. And they were powerful in terms of their decisions. But then gradually, within OPEC itself, some other problems occurred. Between members, some other problems occurred. Some members became weaker than they used to be, due to conflicts, due to wars between them.
Yeah, one of our other collaborators on this show, he's from Venezuela, and he highlights aggressively the failure of Venezuela to keep up with the rest of OPEC.
Well, that is a very good example of how OPEC became vulnerable, how OPEC basically, I shouldn't say went to the point of splitting,
Right.
But then when you look at Venezuela, then if you really want to be fair, you have to figure out whether all the problems that are happening there or happen are internal or some of them are external. So that is something that, in order to be fair, you have to really look at it, Sometimes, no matter how bad a country may be, they may be able to pull out themselves. But then when external forces start to influence in the affairs of the country, then things become a lot worse. In my opinion, Venezuela was one of them, one of the examples. A few other members in the OPEC currently are in the same category. Iran is, for example, one of them. So therefore, back to the OPEC that you mentioned, the influence of OPEC started to diminish. Today, they are still there. But then, even though they are there, the major players are probably not as independent as they used to be in the past.
Absolutely.
That makes a big difference, So, a phone call to a few major players could probably change some variables.
And they are trying to bring a new block in, that's for sure.
Right.
But going back to Venezuela, we see them as sort of a pioneer in getting what they feel they're due. They did the 50-50 profit sharing agreement with the Anglo-American oil companies, and this, from what we can tell, greatly influenced the other OPEC members and especially Saudi Arabia to strike their own deal. And could you talk about how Venezuela's deal set the precedent to lead to OPEC eventually?
Right. I think Venezuela's deals were roughly different, very different. For example, they own some gas stations in the United States. That was unheard of. So that was a part of their operations. So to that extent, I may say that they were very expensive in terms of their operations. And they were doing very well.
And this was in the late 40s.
Right, yeah. Until all of a sudden things started, in my opinion, to politically affect the oil industry. So I may say that the oil industry in our country did not fail just because it was the industry itself. It really failed because of the political problems. So in my opinion, that's why earlier I mentioned one of the commodities that may have some particular characteristics. One of them is oil, and it links with politics. So that is another good example of that. Generation. Right.
In our breakdown, because we'll sort of give a narrative of the history of oil, and we talk about a guy named Daniel Yergin. He's a very well known Pulitzer Prize winner. He said that the 70s was a decade of crisis and redefinition of energy. It was when the oil weapon was unsheathed, and the West suddenly found itself vulnerable to the oil exporting nations.
Exactly.
Can you talk about when he made that claim back then, what people thought about it?
Actually, he is one of the best in terms of providing a good historical perspective of the industry. Mm-hmm. His book is like a textbook.
Right.
And it includes a lot of different dimensions of what the industry has gone through. We mentioned Arab oil embargo. That was the first time that the lines in the United States started to form. That was the first time that the people here, and I was one of them at the time, saw a gasoline that was maybe 15 cents per gallon at that time, 15, 20 cents per gallon, jumping to $1.
$1. Yeah, right.
Oh, yeah, those days. So that was a shock. U.S. Department of Energy initiated a lot of efforts to see what to do. Actually, U.S. DOE, Department of Energy, didn't really exist before all those activities went through. So when they came out to address the demand, the supply, and all the other things, then a lot of things happened.
Could you speak on the difference between how the Nixon administration responded to it versus how the Carter administration did?
I really cannot make a different distinction, but I may say that we were, I guess, the two administrations. The first one was pretty much taking the events as they were happening.
Mm-hmm. But you were still in the Vietnam War, right?
Right, yeah. They were absorbing without being too aggressive in influencing it. But gradually, the reactions of our administrations, one after the other, has been more and more, I should say, intrusive, meaning that they don't take it. Mm-hmm. They try to influence it. That's the way I am perceiving it over the last 40 years.
Right.
For example, the Arab oil embargo, when it happened, nobody sent the troops to basically do something. But today, I don't know. I'm not joking, but today a lot of things could happen.
Yep. And going back to private companies, how would you say that major industry executives have tried to standardize the way that they operate their firms?
I think in terms of standardization, I may say that, unfortunately, they always set the rules without probably being noticed that much. Mm-hmm. I'll just give you one example, which I came across very, very recently. In 1982, a long time ago, or maybe a decade after the date that you refer to, Exxon produced a report internally to find the effect of CO2 on climate. It's a written report.
Right.
It was released very recently. I came across it maybe 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And you will be surprised that at that time,
looking at the ozone emissions,
CO2 and emission was estimated, was calibrated, was documented, was released within the company. Mm-hmm. And At that time, the forecast for 42 years later, which is today, was about 1.2 degrees above the base that they were looking at, which is surprising. That's what we do know today.
Yeah.
Well, that was 42 years ago. But that report was internal in the company. They never released it. Now, I encourage people to have a look at that report, which was produced 42 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's astronomical when such a forecast with such an accuracy was put together. Now, in terms of what you call about management and how they did.
Yeah, and this was before the emission standards were raised?
Well, at that time, we were still talking about environment.
Right.
At that time,
the cars got smaller.
Right,
you know.
On and off, the issue of environment was mentioned, but nobody was really taking it seriously. So in terms of if you are a CEO of a company, if you have some obligation to the public, it could be questioned. So where were you? You knew the report. You knew the effect, but you kept the report internally, and were you obligated to the public? Obviously you were, but then I am pretty sure they have their own explanations. They will come forward and tell you, hey, wait a minute. Who is going to believe a forecast for 42 years from now? Who knows what may happen?
Yeah.
Who knows what other technological improvements could occur that could change this forecast? All forecasts, as we all know, are as-if forecasts, meaning that we usually don't say as-if forecast. We drop the terminology to just a single word of forecasting. But all forecasts are as-if forecasts, meaning that if the conditions that are currently available prevails, then this is the forecast.
Right.
Okay. So they could argue that, well, we learned about the forecast, but we couldn't take it seriously. Well, that's the explanation.
I'm sure others, came with a range. We have an interval. We figure the temperature will change between, and Exxon got it right on the nose.
Now we are more serious. Obviously, now we are definitely more serious. But even today, I am afraid to mention that there is still some concern because even in today's environment, the political dimension of energy and especially oil is still open. I mean, we never really know how the next administration, I'm not forecasting anything right now, how the next administration is going to look at global warming. Within our own state here, which is Florida, a while back, we were discouraged to talk about global warming. It was not official, but we were discouraged, because some people who were at the helm of the, I should say, government believed the other way around, So even today, I don't know how to interpret it.
Yeah.
And then I may say that there is also another factor. We are heterogeneous in terms of our beliefs. Some are strongly believing in it. Some still may doubt it. And some are stuck in the middle. Sometimes they go one way or the other. And then to add complications to this heterogeneity, there are a few studies that indicate that maybe technological improvements could solve the problem.
With the cleaning and the carbon recycling.
So if you are an iffy person, you are going to waver between the two and then flip the coin to your advantage. So those things are there.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us for the first weekly Panther Business Briefing on the theme of oil and gas. We'll be back again next week to continue the discussion. This time with a new guest, Dr. Mario Loyola, who will bring us up to speed on the current regulatory issues surrounding the industry, as well as some additional insight on the topics we discussed today with Dr. Parhizgari.